Hello and welcome to the tutorial for the Adventure Game Engine. I'm going to show you how to use the engine, how to set it up and how it all works. So right now we have a completely empty project besides some game data where I already put some assets in that we want to use in this example, but other than that it's completely empty. Also we have a completely empty scene, so if you start and you have a camera, just delete that. It's better if it's completely empty. So now we're going to import the package. And just import everything here. And then I'm going to show you how we will set up the engine to work with your own game. Okay, now the engine is set up. The first thing that we want to do now is we're going to the example folder and we're going to duplicate the example config. This saves some time because we don't have to set up everything new. So we're taking the example config and we just move it to our game data folder. Important thing is the folder that the config file is in will also automatically be the folder where every game data and logic will be stored. So you want to make sure that this config file is in a folder that's more or less empty or where you can put all the stuff. I'm just going to remove this. Let's call this tutorial config. What we want to change is the game data path. Let's call the tutorial as well. That's the subdirectory where all the data will be stored, and you want to have one that's unique to your project. Then you can specify the folder where save games will go. We're just going to leave that at saves. This will later be, if you make a build, will just be in the build directory, but you can specify any other directory here. Then we have a fallback language. The game automatically tries to load language from the actual client machine, but if that language file doesn't exist, it falls back and loads English in this case, which is just fine. Then the second config file we can create this here. Create AG is the media config. Going to call that tutorial media. And we're just going to specify a normal text color. That's when normal text is just shown in text boxes somewhere, maybe this color. And we're going to specify one dialog color that we might need later. Let's take this one. And while we're at it, we can also already add our media sprite here for the item. This is the mushroom item. Let's drag this in a second time that it's actually in there. Okay, now we have set up our two config files. Now we can create the actual engine in the scene. That's under game object, AGE, and engine core. When you click that and you haven't imported TextMesh Pro yet, you just need to import the essentials, and that's it. Okay, now you see we got a lot of stuff in here. First, what you want to do is go to the AGE core and drag in your config files here, the tutorial config at config, and the tutorial media at media. So that's everything you need for the setup here. Now the actual base engine is set up. Now before I go into actually creating the scenes and stuff, let me show you a little graph here to explain a bit more in general terms how the Adventure Game Engine works from a data structure standpoint. So in general we have three domains. We have the rooms, we have a global domain, and we have the inventory. And then the most important thing are the interactables and the game states. Interactables is everything that holds logic in the game. So we got the scene interactables. Those are actual things in the scene that you can click on and maybe you can look at it, or it's a character you can talk to. Then you have virtual interactables. They are also part of a room, but you can't see them in the room. They can execute logic in the background unseen to the player. And then we got the global interactables. Sometimes you want to have some logic that can be triggered from any room. Then you can put the global interactables here. They are just a subcategory or a different kind of a virtual interactable that's just flagged global and stored outside of the room. And last but not least, items in the Adventure Game Engines are also just interactables, but they are not stored in a room and they look a bit differently, but they are stored in the player inventory. So they are only accessible if the player actually has that item. Game states are just variables that you can store and check against. Every interactable can have different actions and you can have conditions on those. And these conditions are always game states. So you can say, okay, in one room you set a variable like, okay, visited this room to 1, and then in a different room you can check if you have visited that room. And these game states are also part of the save file later on. That's how the game later knows what the player actually did in the game. Other parts are proximity triggers. They can just trigger interactables if you walk into them or if you exit them. You have position markers. They are just little helpers. So you can specify positions in your room that you can then reference in your interactables. You have timers when you want to trigger an interactable after a certain amount of time or repeatedly. Then you got the dialogue data, that's just the data structure for dialogues in general. You got the localization keys. As you've seen with the language before, the game can be fully localized. It will automatically create CSV files that you can then put in different languages quite handily. Okay, so much for the theory. Now let's get back into action. Now we've seen the main structure. We want to do here is to create our first room. So we go to game object, AGE, and create a room. This created this base room here. Maybe we want to call that first room. And rooms are generally stored as prefabs and loaded. So we are going to create a new folder in our game data, call that rooms. And before we change anything, we're just going to drag our newly created room in there as a prefab. And we can delete it from the scene. And on the HE core, you see there's a room handler script. And we can drag rooms on this room handler script. And actually, the first room in this list will be the starting room that's loaded when the game starts. Okay, now we set up the rooms and the engine. Now let's go into the room itself. Okay, as you can see, you don't see a lot, so let me start by dragging in the background for the first room. These are just sprites, and I'm going to put that under scenery. Okay, the next thing that we want to go on the checkout is the room config. We've got room bounds that you can specify here. That's the yellow rectangle. Currently, it's just the whole picture, so there won't be any scrolling if the player has screen resolution or aspect ratio that fits this image, which is 16:9, but you can create images that are wider or higher and you have some scrolling, and then you specify the bounds so the camera is not scrolling out of bounds. So now we have an identifier we can give to the room. Let's call it first room. That will later show on in the editor. And important, we need to specify our config here again. So we go back to game data, take our tutorial config and put it in here. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is we want to define the navigation area where our character can walk. For this, we go to navigation, we open this, and we got the navigation shapes. And you see there are 2 shapes available, walkable and unwalkable. You can add more to those. These are just standard here. And you can see they are tagged as walkable, respectively as unwalkable. With that, you can specify the navigation shape where the player can actually walk. As you can see, as standard, there's a polygon collider, 2D, but you can also use box colliders if you want. Now we're going to use the edit bounding volume function for the polygon collider, so we can just drag this collider in this scene and specify the area where the player should be allowed to walk. Let's do it here. Maybe he's only using this path around here, and then he's allowed to go down there, all the way to the right, maybe around here, there, and maybe not all that way, there, and going to the way. Yeah, I think that looks fine. And then you just go to navigation and you go into click Bake 2D. Okay, that's it. Now the navigation shape is set. Another thing that you want to set up under room config is the character scaler. That's important because, well, the game is 2D, so you won't have automatically scaling for a character that goes into the depth of the image because there is no depth, obviously, so you need to work around that. And for that, we have the character scaler script, which defines how a character should get smaller when he walks far away or gets bigger when he walks in front. And also you can change the order layer on the sprite. which is important if you, for example, have an object in the middle and you want the player to be able to walk around behind it and in front of it. The order layer of the sprite has to change at that height. So what we see here is a red line, which specifies the overall height of our walkable area. So you can scale that here with the size, with the scale of the object itself. And then we have the points defined on this line. So currently we only have 2 points, so it's just this one line, very simple, and we can specify where these points start and end. So the 1 point is at 0% and 1 at 100%, so it's the whole length of our object. And then we have a scale, which is currently set at 1, 1, and the order layer is 2, 2, which means that the character will always be the same size, which we obviously don't want. So we want to go and reduce the size if he's going farther away and maybe increase the size a bit, because that's very theoretically. You can also click on Show Dummy, which creates a player object as a child here, player character. And if you move that around in the scene, you can see how the character scales. So you see if it's farther away, it's getting smaller. If it's nearer, it's bigger. Generally, I feel that the character is a bit too small, so we can change the overall base scale of the character and see how tall he is now. Maybe even a bit bigger, I would say. Yeah, so this is fine. Okay, don't forget to hide the dummy again, because you don't want to see that later in the scene. Okay, the last thing that we're going to do now is we're going to specify the start position for the character. For that, we're going to create a position marker. So let's go to position markers, AGA, position marker. We're going to call this start position, and we're going to move it where we want our player characters to start, over there. Okay, that's the basic setup for the room. Now what we're going to do, we're going back to our scene. I've already specified the room here. So now we can add the logic, and we just do that by hitting the play button and going in the in-game editor. So we click on Start New Game. And as you can see, we are in a room here, but we haven't set up the start position with logic yet, so the character is just floating mid-air. What you want to do here is you're just pressing F1 to switch between the edit mode and the play mode. And now you see you have some options up here, and we're going for an interactable. You have a list of all interactables. Currently we have none, but you can create a virtual interactable down here. So this is a virtual interactable player can't click on, but we can specify some logic like setting up the start position. So we're calling this set start position, going to edit here. Now it's showing up here. Now we can click on it. Yeah, we can change the name if we want to. We can switch it to a global interactable, but this is only the start position for this room, so it's fine that it's local. And we're going to add an interaction here. So you have different kind of triggers here that you can specify. What we want is on start, because it should happen on the start of the game. We don't have any conditions currently for that. So we go into action, and you can select a variety of actions here, and we have a move player action. And now we could either type in the name of the position mark, or we can just click edit and select it here. And you see it's there. Now, to see if this works, we reload the room. We can click rooms, click on the first room, and ta-da, our player character has spawned on the starting position, and we got our first logic down. And as you can see, we can walk around our navigation shape here, and everything works fine. Okay, now obviously we want to do something a bit more interesting. So I'm going back to our room, and we're going to add our first scene interactables. So we go to interactables, AGE, interactable. And what you can see here, an interactable consists of the script itself, of a box collider, which specifies where you can click on it in the game. And one thing that's probably interesting, this box collider doesn't have to be centered around the interactable, because sometimes you might want the position of the interactable is actually where your character will walk to, but sometimes you want to be the click position a bit different than the position your character walks to, so you can define those. Then you have a sprite renderer, which currently just holds this dummy sprite, so we're going to replace that with an actual item here, which the mushroom. Now just going to move that maybe down here, and we have a little mushroom in the scene. Okay, now we go to the in-game editor and put some logic on that mushroom. As you can see, if we press F1, it shows up as a scene interactable now. But first, what we want to do is we want the player to be able to pick up that mushroom. So what we need first is an item for the inventory that the player can get there. We don't have currently any, so we click create item, we click on that empty item, it's called mushroom, we put in a little description, so if the player looks at the mushroom, he gets a little text here. We can specify it if the item can be used, we don't need that currently, and we can select an icon. We don't have any interactions yet for that item, so that's fine. We have the item created, and now we click on the item in the scene, the interactable. We also give that a name in the scene. It's also mushroom. And we specify that it can be picked up. These interactions just will disable or enable the UI for the player. The interaction range will specify how close the character has to move to the item. Standard, it's half of the box collider size, so it walks right to the edge. That's fine for this case, but sometimes you might have something that's a bit farther away, or the location that the player can't reach, and then you might want to increase that range. Now we go to interactions. We just go to on take in this condition. We click on actions, and we have the pickup item. There are 3 different: pickup, create, and remove. Pickup will remove the item from the scene automatically, so it's just in the inventory and it doesn't show up anymore. With create and remove item, you can specifically manually create items in the inventory or remove them. So, but currently we want to pick up the item. Now we can select it, the item that should be created after the pickup. We close this, we can press F1 to go back in the game mode. Now you can see the mushroom. We can, well, let's first look at it, maybe that you see that. Nice looking mushroom, I want it. And we can pick up the mushroom. Now we have picked it up and it appeared in our inventory, and we can look at it in our inventory. So the next thing I want to show you is how to travel between different rooms. So for that we obviously need a second room, just like before. Game object, create a room. We call this second room. Going to drag this as a prefab in our rooms folder. Delete and add to our room list. And we go to our second room. Now we're going to add the background to our scenery and go to the room config. What you can see now is that the yellow rectangle is not big enough because this scene is larger. So we increase the size until the rectangle fits the scene. So this works. We call this second room. Going to add the config again. Going to our character scaler. Let's just create the dummy right away. The size seems fine, but we want this to be a bit smaller, not so much as in the first one. And I think we can go bigger here right away. Let's check this out. Oh, that was the wrong way. Sorry. Let's do it this way around. Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, that's fine. Going to hide the dummy, and we're going to create our navigation shape here. This down there, over here, all the way. over here. Yeah, that should do it. Let's bake it. Okay, and we're going to create our start position here. Start position, just like not position. And maybe the player comes from down here. Okay, what we want to do now is if the player leaves the room because he gets close to the exit. So we need a proximity trigger for this. So we go to proximity trigger, G, create a proximity trigger. As you can see, that's just another script, but with a box collider. We can move it down here maybe. The box collider specifies where you have to click actually, and the edges of the collider where you have to enter to leave the scene. So this should be roughly fine here. Maybe we give it a name. No, it's an exit south. Okay, that's the setup for our second room. Now we go back to our first room, and we're also going to add a proximity trigger here. But up here at the pathway, going to call that exit north. And what we also want to do is we want to specify a different starting position here. Because if you come from the other room, you don't want to go back to your first starting position down here, but you want to enter from the path at the north. So we call this enter north, and we're going to move it around here. Okay, that's the setup. Now we're going into the edit mode. Start new game. First thing that we want to do now is we need some logic so that the start position is only set really at the beginning and not when you're coming from the north. So we're going to change our interactable for our start position here. We open this and we're going to add a condition. So that's where the states come in. So we can define a state and we call it, for example, direction. And we say, okay, the direction has to have the value 0 for this trigger to start. Fine. Now we can add another virtual interactable, call this enter north. And in this part, we also say that it should trigger on start, but it has the opposite condition. The direction has to be 1 for this to trigger. And then we have an action, move the player, and not to our start position, but to enter north. Okay. Now we need a logic for the proximity trigger to trigger to leave the room. So that's another virtual. We call this exit north. We click on it. We add an interaction. And on this, we have to specify on proximity because it should be triggered by the proximity trigger. Don't have any conditions for this. And as an action, we go to change room and we can specify a room index, which should be 1 for the other room. Okay, that's everything we need in this room. We can just test this. No, we have to hook up the proximity trigger first to our script here, the exit north, and we say, okay, if the player enters and if he specifically clicked on it. If we don't have this, then he can walk through it and it will also be triggered. You need that sometimes, but in this occasion, we want the player to explicitly click on the trigger to trigger it. Click on the proximity trigger, yeah. Okay, now we click here and we see that the room has changed to a new room. So what we want to do here is also go to the interactables at the starting position. We only need 1 here because there's only 1 way to enter the scene. So we don't need any conditions here. We just go to on start, actions, move player, start position. And the other thing we need here is the exit south if you want to go back. Now for the exit south, we also go on the proximity, but we don't not only change the room, we only also change the state. The one we've seen before, I can just click on, no, I can't, sorry. I can just enter this here direction and change the state to the value of 1. This will tell the other room that the position should be coming from the north and not from the other start position. And also, obviously, we want to actually change the room back to 0. Okay, now you can see we can walk down here. Oh no, again, forgot to hook up the proximity trigger, exit south, trigger on exit has to be clicked on. And now we can click on it and we correctly enter from the north. And we can go back to here and we set our start position here. So we got 2 rooms perfectly set up. Now we want the player to be able to do something with the mushroom, so we go back to the second room here, and we're going to add an interactable in the scene, IGE interactable. Going to set maybe the background 1 layer behind. Okay, now we can see the interactable here, and we're going to use the signpost. So maybe we want the clickable area to be a bit bigger, and the signpost is maybe just standing around here, and maybe we change the navigation mesh so that this is a dead end. So let's go to the walkable one and move these over to here and bake the mesh again. And the idea is you can use the mushroom on the shield and then you win the game. Don't ask me why, this doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to show you how this would work. Okay, now we set that up. We can just go back in the play mode, start a new game, go to a room. Well, we can always just click on the room here. This is a bit easier maybe. Now we have this sign. Just I have some text here. Mushroom, you can't actually do anything with it directly, but what you can do, we add an interaction here, you can have a use with interaction. And if you select as a trigger the use with, you can select an item that should be able to be used with it. In this case, it's the mushroom. Now, what we're going to do, we want to first show a dialogue that tells us something and then trigger the actual game one. So in this dialog, we click in on edit. This is the dialog editor. You can select a position where the dialog should be shown. In this case, not above the signpost, but above the player. You can always click player character, and we can say what it says. Then we can select the dialog color. You can specify a duration if the dialog should vanish after a specific time, or you can just leave it to 0 if the player has to click. Now we also want to trigger an action after the dialog. So we click this and then it opens this up where the action is, and we're going to have this on the signpost right away. So it will trigger the after action trigger on the signpost. We click save. And what we can do now on the interaction, we add a second one, and here we have the after dialog trigger, and as an action we can say where was it, game over, and game one we toggle this to true because other way around it's a game over. Okay, let's see if this works. So currently we don't have the mushroom, so we need to go back here, going to pick up a mushroom. Going back to the first room, going over here, get the mushroom from the inventory, and use it on the signpost. Okay, we can't get close enough because we changed the navigation shape. So we just go in here and increase the interaction range a bit for now. Maybe that's enough. Yes. I'm going to put the shroom on the post, click, and we won the game. Yeah, so that's basically it. Obviously, we didn't go through all the actions you can do, all the conditions and all that stuff, but you can figure out that yourself. I would say go to the example folder, open the example. This will show you a whole lot of more interactions. There's actually a complete scene in there with characters and all the different types of interactions you can do. And other than that, you can also obviously have a look at the manual. So I hope this was a bit helpful. You can now create your own point-and-click adventures with ease. And with that, have fun. See ya.